I'm so delighted to be here to help recognize and celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Center for Gun Policy and Research at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and to hear from some of the work underway by the center's researchers. One of the real strengths of the center is its focus on connecting research to policy. This panel offers 3 timely examples of the center's work on topics that are subject to present-day debate and discussion by policymakers, advocates, law enforcement, and community members. The 3 topics we'll cover are extreme risk protection orders, firearms licensing, and ghost guns. Dr. Shannon Frattaroli, let me start with you. Can you explain for us what are extreme risk protection orders and what are you learning about them in your research?
Sure. Extreme Risk Protection Order laws, or ERPO, are a civil order that allows people who are on the front lines of witnessing violence to go to a court and ask that the court temporarily prohibit a person from purchasing and possessing guns while that crisis that they're in is underway. So ERPO laws are now in place in 19 states in the District of Columbia. And what we're really looking at from a research perspective now is how to assure that the implementation of those laws is happening in a way that's going to maximize the public health benefit from them. So ERPOs are a new kind of law, so making sure that law enforcement, including the courts, frontline law enforcement who petition for these orders, serve the orders, and help to dispossess people temporarily of their firearms, they really need support and technical assistance to learn how to do those processes and do them in a way that's going to adhere to due process protections under the law and be mindful of the need for equity in the implementation of this law. So our research is really focusing on that crucial implementation question of how can we assure that these laws are being used in a way that's going to maximize the public's health.
And for states that don't already have ERPOs, what are the public health benefits and what should policymakers in those states be thinking about as they contemplate enacting ERPOs in those places?
Great question. Well, when I think about the benefits of ERPOs, a couple things come to mind. One is that they're based on domestic violence restraining order laws. And we know from decades of research in that space that when you remove guns temporarily from domestic violence offenders, we see statistically significant reductions in intimate partner gun homicides specifically and intimate partner homicides generally. So there's good reason to think that ERPOs, which essentially work through the same mechanism, will also have good effects. I've looked at ERPO petitions in many states at this point in time, and it's always striking to me really how severe the crises are that people are in that prompt someone to come before the court and ask for protection.
Thank you, Dr. Frattaroli. It's wonderful to hear that so many policymakers are really paying attention to that research. Let's switch gears now and go to Dr. Cassandra Crifasi. And Dr. Crifasi, I'd like you to tell us about firearms licensing. This is a policy that's been around for a number of years, but it's getting renewed attention just over the last few years. What is firearms licensing, and what are you learning in your research?
So licensing systems are laws that states in the US have put into place to build out a more robust system to identify and screen out individuals who are prohibited from owning a firearm. This could be because of criminal history or mental health related conditions. These systems involve an application to state or local law enforcement. As part of that application, individuals often submit fingerprints. Law enforcement use more records than may be available under the federal system, and they also have more time to complete those background checks, which fills an important gap in federal law. These laws require that no matter who you want to purchase a firearm from, you must first have this valid license that you show, which can increase accountability in the way firearms move from lawful sales and then potentially into an underground market. What we're learning from our research is that there is substantial public safety benefits when licensing laws are in place. For example, we see fewer guns available for use in crime. We see lower rates of firearm homicide, including mass shootings. States with these laws have lower rates of firearm suicide as well, which may be due in part to delaying impulsive acquisition of a firearm that could be used to harm oneself. We see lower rates of law enforcement officers being shot in the line of duty. And importantly, we have some new work that's coming out that shows that states with licensing laws, strong licensing laws, have lower rates of civilians being shot by police as well.
Those are incredibly powerful findings. How can policymakers act on what you're learning?
It's a great question. So what we've seen from repeated research studies, looking at different study designs, different units of analysis, different outcomes, is overwhelmingly licensing laws have very significant public safety benefits. But beyond the research evidence, we actually see very broad public support for these laws as well. When you ask a nationally representative sample of adults their perspectives on these laws, you see more than 75% of US adults support requiring prospective gun purchasers to first get a license. This includes more than 60% of gun owners being supportive of these systems. If you look at states where licensing laws are already in place, where presumably gun owners have experience functioning in these systems, the support for licensing laws jumps to more than 75% among gun owners. Another key group that we've looked at is support among African Americans living in metropolitan areas. This is a demographic that experiences disproportionately high rates of gun homicide, and support among this group is at 80%.
It's so important to track not just effectiveness of the policies, but also how the policies are perceived by members of the public who are going to be impacted by them. Thank you very much, Dr. Crifasi. Next, Dr. Alex McCourt. Dr. McCourt, you've done a lot of thinking about ghost guns. Can you tell us what are ghost guns and what do we know about them?
Sure. So ghost guns are untraceable firearms that can be assembled by consumers at home. In most cases, these are either 3D printed or they're constructed from component parts that can be ordered as part of a kit or separately. These guns, unlike your typical gun, are not traceable. They lack serial numbers and other markings that would allow law enforcement to identify the original manufacturer or seller. These kits and the code needed for 3D printed guns are often marketed as a way to construct an unregistered, untraceable, but functioning gun in very short periods of time, ranging from just minutes to hours.
And what do we know about the use of ghost guns? Are law enforcement agencies recovering these types of guns, and how big a problem is it?
We know that law enforcement agencies are recovering these guns. There are kind of sparse anecdotal reports of them being used in crime, them being recovered in crime. But because they're not traceable, there's really very little data. As a result, we have very little research on ghost guns. This is one of the problems, is the lack of data. And another problem, I think, is lack of awareness. So those are two areas that we're really trying to focus on in our work. The first is collecting data and synthesizing it to understand the scope of the problem. But also, we're trying to raise awareness by creating educational materials so that members of the public and policymakers can learn about ghost guns.
This sounds like an incredibly important issue and potentially a big problem. What is it that you hope policymakers might do to address the issue of ghost guns?
I think there are a few things that are really important for policymakers to keep in mind. The first is maybe the way that ghost guns subvert all of these other gun policies that we've talked about. So we know the least about ghost guns, but one big problem with ghost guns is that they can be purchased without a background check. So if you want to purchase one of these kits, you can do so without undergoing a background check. So even if you're otherwise prohibited from possessing a firearm, you can buy the component parts, or you can buy a ghost gun kit and you can make it at home. One big problem with this is that the benefits that we're seeing from purchaser licensing and even from ERPOs are maybe kind of subverted or may not be as beneficial if people are able to access these guns that shouldn't otherwise be able to. So that's really important for policymakers to understand. Another key thing is that there are some states that have adopted policies to regulate ghost guns. The approaches vary. Some states have tried to just ban them entirely. Other states have tried to require ghost gun owners to come in and add serial numbers to their guns. But most importantly, because we don't have data, we don't know what the best evidence-based policy is. We don't know what the most effective policy is. So what I think is really important is for policymakers to try to gather data and make this data public. We need reliable public data that documents the use of untraceable ghost guns in violence.
Thank you very much, Dr. McCourt, and thank you all. The work that you're doing is incredibly relevant, it's timely, and it's so important. Before we close, I'd like to ask each of you to tell us what lies ahead for you. What are you excited about as you think about the next chapter for the center? Let's start with you, Cass.
Thanks, Nina. There are two things that we're very excited about that will be coming up in our work. So one is continuing our research on the effectiveness of licensing, looking at the impacts on certain demographic subgroups. So what are the impacts of these policies on adolescents and emerging adults, and as well as racial and ethnic minorities? A second area of work that I'm very excited about is related to a different form of licensing, and that's concealed carry licensing. We have a team that's working to develop a virtual reality system that will test the appropriateness and accuracy of civilian gun use. And this has very important implications for how states and policymakers think about the ways they regulate civilian gun carrying in public.
Terrific, thank you. Shannon, let's go to you next.
So one of the things that I'm very excited about with regard to the center's work is the evidence that we're producing and the ability to communicate with policymakers, with stakeholders who are committed to this issue about what works and what's going to make a difference in communities. And what oftentimes makes a difference is not just assuring that we have good policies in place, but assuring that we have the infrastructure and systems in place to support implementation and enforcement of those policies. And increasingly, we're finding ways within the center to inform that side of the policy process, which is incredibly exciting for the future of our work and the impact that we can have.
Thank you. And last but not least, Alex, what excites you about the future of your work and the center?
There are a lot of important and exciting things that we're working on, but I think the two most exciting to me have to do with data collection. So I already mentioned trying to collect ghost gun data, but we're also working on a project that is designed to generate more reliable non-fatal injury data, which I think is a really exciting and new development. And the more data that we have, the better we're able to evaluate and develop evidence-based policy. But we can also look at really important details of the effects of these policies, like how they impact different communities and how maybe they affect disparities in violence and also disparities in law enforcement.
Thank you all. This has really been my great pleasure. I very much share your excitement about the next chapter for the center's work, especially as you build equity into the research and policy thinking that you're doing.